Good afternoon and welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more, we hope you enjoy today's session, Afghan Adjustment Act, what it means for Afghan neighbors and for welcomers. We here at Refugee Welcome Collective collaborate with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship across the United States. Let's see, next slide. As a reminder for everyone joining the Lunch and Learn today, there is a control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, a recording and links will be sent to everyone after today's webinar. This brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Susanna Cunningham. Susanna leads the Congressional Affairs Office for the Resettlement Agency, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, LIRS. In her role, she also co-chairs the Legislative Working Group for Evacuate Our Allies, a national coalition of human rights, religious, and refugee resettlement organizations working alongside veterans and civilians to evacuate at-risk Afghan allies. Prior to joining LIRS, Cunningham worked at the nexus of immigration, national security, and foreign policy for 15 years in various roles in the Middle East and North Africa. In 2008, Susanna co-founded the Resettlement Legal Aid Project, RLAP, an award-winning legal clinic originally founded in Cairo, Egypt, to serve Iraqi refugees. Today, RLAP is the only refugee rights legal clinic serving Egypt's sizable refugee population and continues to serve regardless of nationality, ethnicity, gender, or religion. Cunningham is a Truman National Security Fellow and is a native of Houston, Texas. I also want to mention before I turn it over to Susanna that she's being a trooper here with us. We're actually having, and I wanted to explain to all the attendees, we're having some audio issues. So Susanna had supplied us with some great videos to share, although you won't be able to hear them. So we are going to be playing some parts of the videos, and Susanna might narrate a bit, but regardless, we'll also send you links with the videos. So we'll show you some of the images, but we'll also in the post-session email give you the links so that you can watch the videos completely. But with that, I'll hand it over to you, Susanna.
Thanks so much, Brianne. Hi, it's wonderful to be with you here today. I'm especially excited to be with you here today to talk about a bill that means a great deal to a lot of people from a pretty diverse background. I've had the pleasure of working with, as Brianne said, the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition, which is what we describe as a big tent coalition. Folks who come from very different backgrounds that are driven by deeply held values coalescing around this bill that seeks to provide lasting safety for Afghans, at-risk Afghans and allies. So it is wonderful to be with you here today. When Brianne first approached to talk about this and have this sort of lunch and learn around the bill, my first thought was, I go in every week to, a dozen or more legislative meetings, and I talk to staff about in congressional offices about why this bill is needed, or we'll talk to a group who evacuated Afghans last year or continue to work on relocation to ensure that at-risk Afghans can get here to the U.S. I didn't know if we were starting at the same basis where folks had also worked on evacuations. It is possible that many of you listening have actively worked to try to evacuate folks out of Afghanistan or are still doing so. And if you are, thank you so much. Just a profound sense of gratitude for your service on this. So I think one of the things, when we think about service, we've just passed Veterans Day last Friday, and we could not talk about this work if we didn't talk about the role and the relationship that veterans have had in interpreters' cases for more than a decade. My own career abroad in Cairo began working with veterans, active military service members who were working on direct access cases for Iraqis, for their interpreters or drivers or people who've been put at risk because of their affiliation with the US or coalition forces. And the reason why this is, it's not all of the story, but it's part of the story, and an important part, is because it was veterans who, when President Biden confirmed the intent to withdraw US troops in September 2021, at that moment, it was veterans who were most, alongside Afghan applicants, who were most intimately aware of the failings of the special immigrant visa program, which was created for Afghan interpreters who'd served at that point 24 months, who'd served the US military, often as interpreters. So they knew, because of the sort of dysfunction and delays that went along with that special immigrant visa program, and where there were tens of thousands of still active applicants, over 13,000 who had all submitted every bit of documentation that the US government had ever asked for them. So it was literally just to the US governments. It was in their court to do something to move their applications forward. So in April 2021, when Biden confirmed the intent to withdraw, we immediately, within a week or two, LIRS was having conversations with folks that we'd work with. Some of my background included working with military veterans for so long. They had my phone number, essentially. We had each other's phone number, and immediately knew the April to September deadline wasn't going to get enough people who were at risk out, even if everything went, ideally for any planners of the withdrawal. To which LRS and Evacuate Our Allies took no position, only that if you leave, that you make sure that those who are at risk because of their association with you are protected, and that at-risk reporters, women's rights leaders, etc., be able to have safety. So we'll play this. Grace, if you don't mind, we can play this video, and I mean, you won't be able to hear the audio, but that's okay. The veteran here is veteran Matt Zeller. I've gotten to work with him for years. He's been an advocate for Afghan SIV applicants for maybe about a decade now. His own story is one who was saved by his interpreter, Janice. If you were to Google his name, the story of Matt and his interpreter, Janice, with whom he remains close, is well documented. His interpreter saved his life in combat and struggled and was persecuted because of his affiliation with the US military. And Matt Zeller worked to try to get him out through the SIV program, which was plagued, as it has been ever, with just tremendous delays and dysfunction that he advocated to overcome. This video was published on July 1st of 2021. And the reason why I included it in the slides is because it's a timestamp. It's a timestamp of veterans and resettlement partners and human rights groups like Human Rights First and Truman National Security Project, all familiar with interpreters' active cases that were just completely clogged in the SIV pipeline application process, not moving. So we knew by July 1st, we knew by April 1st, 2021, that the SIV program was not going to save a lot of people, that Congress had built a program to save. The special immigrant visa program had been built for people who were at risk because of their association with the US military. And we knew then that it wouldn't be. And we had rallies, we had press conferences with members of Congress, which the next video would show, that in the summer of 2021, really calling on the administration to have a plan for these folks, because the SIV program would not save them. And in this moment, we're working with Congress, with veterans on Capitol Hill. We're working with Afghans who have successfully made it through the SIV program, but have family left behind who also served and whose own applications were delayed for reasons that we have always said that didn't work in the SIV application process. And then August 15th essentially comes around, and these final provinces that we know from the national security folks who are part of our Big Tent coalition, the veterans that are part of our coalition, and the Afghans who are part of our coalition, that some pretty significant provinces have fallen outside of Kabul, and that's in game for the ability to hold and be able to continue to have an evacuation pipeline through any formal means like the SIV program. And the reason why is because the US Embassy would not last in Kabul, would not stand. And at that point, we emailed legislators that we'd rallied with, held press conferences with, and said, everything that we have been seeking to avoid is now coming. There needs to be a means to get these folks out. And for the months before August 15th, we had been working with folks who had been part of previous evacuations. So there was after action reports. There were all of these resources on the evacuation of Vietnamese evacuees after the fall of Vietnam, after the fall of Saigon. We had a lot of resources. We even had former resettlement CEOs who were still living, who worked that evacuation, who were very familiar with it. We had Vietnam vets saying, all along up to it, advising our campaign and saying, don't end up the way we did. Don't be in the situation we did where you couldn't get folks out, you couldn't save people. And that echoed in my mind when I was writing legislators, and I said this to them when legislative offices. We knew at every moment beforehand that this was the risk, this was the gamble, and we were trying so hard to stop it. Even going so far as evacuate our allies, along with Congressman Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, created, edited, drafted, and published an evacuation plan. Meaning we knew before the fall of the Afghan elected government that if you couldn't get people out through the SIV program, that you would have to use another function to get them out. And that historically that had been humanitarian parole, that for Vietnamese that had meant they first went to the American territory of Guam. Iraqi Kurds also were evacuated in the 1990s and they went to Fort Dix. We had a number of examples in New Jersey. We had a number of examples of ways that people could be evacuated through historical examples. And so when folks came in, when the Afghan elected government fell, and we had 2,500 people come on just before that who had, they were just about to receive their SIV visas, the special immigrant visas, in their passport, and they were put on planes out of Kabul, on July 28th, and they arrived and they were processed at Fort Lee in Virginia under humanitarian parole. And there was a moment where we were scratching our heads, if you're just at the door of the SIV program, which Congress has created to have all of these services and benefits that the Refugee Assistance Program has, why would you bring people under humanitarian parole? And the realization was that was, in fact, the beginning of the evacuation. That was the administration finally registering that they couldn't alone rely on the SIV program, even if Kabul was held by the Afghan elected government. Provinces where, outer provinces in Afghanistan where SIV, special immigrant visa holders or applicants lived, would not necessarily be safe. So all of these people arrive on humanitarian parole. It's a temporary status. It's a temporary protection. The first people arrive, they're given it for a year. Latter waves of it will be given it for 2 years, and everyone will eventually be brought up to the 2-year line. But that's it. Humanitarian parole after that ends, and your protection ends. Grace, could we go to the next slide? So all of these people in this incredible feat are going to come under humanitarian parole. And we know up to now that the administration hasn't given us hope or promise that there will be a premeditated, thoughtful evacuation. But when the Afghan elected government falls and people come to the airport, it isn't necessary. We have no indication that people are going to be able to be evacuated. And I'll say that there's a lot of really hard stories in the stories of Afghanistan and the fall of the Afghan elected government and the evacuation and people being resettled here and the strain it has put on communities to do this well and thoughtfully when the influx was sudden rather than thoughtful and sort of tiered. But one of the things that is incredible in this story is where there was not a promise of protection from governments, whether from the Afghan government or from the US government, where there was not a promise of it, even though these are military planes a lot of these folks are evacuated on, it was a whole of society who stood up and said, we will keep their promise. We will keep the promise, even if they won't. So you had military veterans, women's rights groups, human rights groups, reporting associations, USAID, former diplomatic corps, all tapping every single network and contact they had to try to get someone they worked with in Afghanistan, someone they knew to be at risk under a Taliban government, somehow to safety. Now, this crowd you see here, they were equally just like compacted crowds around the Kabul airport. And one of the things a lot of special immigrant visa holders had in the weeks before the fall of the Afghan elected government moved into Kabul because provinces that were being taken week by week by the Taliban meant that they were at risk. So they were going into Kabul. So you had more SIV applicants than normally you would have in Kabul. And they were in active communication with veterans they'd served with in the US or with the diplomatic corps that they'd worked with and maybe been protection for, etc. And when Kabul fell, there were a few days before the Taliban the Taliban agreed to stay outside of Kabul. And then after a few days, the Taliban moved into Kabul and set up checkpoints all along the way. It was at that point that some Taliban members were also knocking on doors of people they knew to have served alongside the US military. And there was fear everywhere, legitimate, credible fear among the population. And for all those people who were texting and calling with their US contact, and even the US embassy closes its doors, shreds all of its active SIV applications documentation, including people whose passports had the visa stamp in them. They destroyed all of these as part of their exit from the US embassy when they relocated their everything to the Kabul airport. But the Taliban sets up checkpoints all along the way to the thoroughfares and roads to the Kabul airport. It's at that point that US contacts and the US government tell SIV applicants or P1, P2 referred people, so people who have priority access to refuge, to destroy any evidence of their any documentation related to their service to the US government, the US mission in Afghanistan, because of those checkpoints. And anyone who's working the evacuation, and there's this Evacuate Our Allies has ballooned over the months from April to August into having lots of different groups who have active contacts in Afghanistan seeking to evacuate. And we're getting videos of people burning documentation of their service to the US that they've kept as precious for years as a part of their applications in order to get through checkpoints. And we're getting photos of checkpoints where they're showing us, how the Taliban is opening up things at different checkpoints. And all of this is when people are actively working evacuations. And once you get to the airport that has this kind of crowd outside of the Kabul gates that you actually see in this photo, it's still impossible to get to the front gates. And even if you had a visa that says, I'm a lawful permanent resident of the United States, or look at my active SIV, look at my visa inside of my passport, please let me in. Even then, it was hard to get through the airport. There were lots of people that we know personally that we were in communication with who were turned back. What you had, when I say this whole of society movement to evacuate folks, is that you had military veterans, diplomatic corps, human rights folks using their active contacts inside of the Kabul airport, meaning active military service members who said, we're keeping the promise. These folks would say, this is my person. I've been working on their case for years. Can you get them out? And they said, listen, the crowd is incredible. And they said, this is what you can do. And they'd have them, for instance, put up a sign that said 783 and throw up a sign with the number 783 or a drawing of an animal or a specific color cap and wave it around. And extraction teams, military service members, extraction teams would go out into the crowd and snap up that person and their family and carry them into the gates. That's how evacuations worked when a crowd was this compacted outside of the Kabul airport. I say all of this because you will understand why the Afghan Adjustment Act is what it is from this experience. So Grace, if we could, next slide. So these folks, there would be, I believe there would be 3 children born on US military planes during the evacuation. So 3 babies, Afghan babies, would be born on those planes as people were evacuated. Folks trying to get to safety. This is another timestamp. This is a rally that we had in July 1st of 2021. Congressman Moulton is shown right there. You know, he would be a major ally to try to draw out from the administration what a risk this was for Afghans, including women's rights advocates, humanitarian leaders, reporters, etc. And Grace, if you can, next slide as well. This would be an incredible effort to get folks out. They would go out of the Kabul airport, and one of the things that's really notable in the moment of the evacuation that will show up in the bill is that there were US military planes, but there still weren't enough planes to get folks out. And there were women's rights groups, there were human rights groups who chartered private planes to try to get their folks out, and they had spare seats. And they turned to the military veterans and they said, do you need any help? And that would be an unchangeable relationship in the creation of the bill, which is that people relied on each other to save each other. And we'll talk in a second about what that meant on the end of creating the bill. So Afghans are taken from the Kabul airport into planes onto what are described as lily pads. They're US bases abroad. They're processed. And at those lily pads, they're put into, you know, are you an SIV recipient? Do you have lawful permanent residence already in the US? Or do you have an active SIV application? Oh, are you someone who is eligible, given a bill that just passed Congress, newly eligible for the SIV program? They decreased the eligibility from 2 years of service to 1. So there was, and then like, are you a women's rights advocate who is going to need to apply for asylum? Are you a family member of the an extended family member of the SIV recipient or applicant? And because you're, you know, the adult sister, you're not going to be eligible under their visa, but you're their family member. We'll put you in this. So they're segmented at bases according to the status, and then they're put on planes according to some of that segmentation, where they get to Customs and Border Protection and individually are adjudicated to decide by the CBP officer if they receive humanitarian parole. It's one of the reasons you see in this photo, there are moments where you hear the news talk about just a massive amount of Afghan evacuees waiting in a terminal in the airport. It's because each one of their cases is being individually looked at for humanitarian parole. That temporary protection will receive at a maximum of 2 years, which I'll just remind you in the timeline, that means it expires in August of 2023 for most of them. So this coming August. Next slide. So we're skipping way ahead. We get to this point a year after the evacuation, and this is a celebratory moment because we've gotten the bill introduced that we're going to talk about today. So the Afghan Adjustment Act is something that tries to solve that problem of that temporary protection. All of those people that got on that plane all of the veterans who worked to get them there, all of the diplomatic corps, all of the women's rights groups who charted planes, when they got them, and our service members will tell you, and all of the people who protected the Kabul airport, including ones that fell after the bombing, all of them got them on that plane and to the US under the idea that they would get lasting protection. But right now they have temporary protection that expires in August of 2023. They either have to make their way through the SI-free program or through the asylum program, both of which is the reason that we got here. The problems of those programs are the reason why we're here in the first place. The SIV program would not save people in April 2021, and they will not save people now because there are such institutional problems with it that cannot be surmounted that veterans have been talking about for a decade. It's one of the reasons we have 3 of the major veteran service organizations, the large legacy ones, the ones that actually have active military living veterans who served in Afghanistan or Iraq. All of them have endorsed the bill because they know the SIV program won't save the people that we seek to protect. And the asylum program, which has massive backlogs and is extremely expensive to make sure that we don't see false asylum denials. And also, remember that moment when I talked about the evacuation, where the US government destroyed documentation inside the US embassy, where US allies were asked to burn documentation to get past those Taliban checkpoints that were checkered throughout Kabul. All of those materials and documentation are things that are urgently necessary as part of the asylum application. So by the nature of the evacuation, the asylum program will also not save these folks. Luckily, when we talked about that plan we put together with Congressman Moulton, we had an idea of how previous evacuations had happened. And then for Vietnamese after the fall of Saigon, for Iraqi Kurds in the 1990s, for Cubans decades before this, after the rise of Castro, we had something called an Adjustment Act, which would en masse allow people to seek adjustment. So would recognize the status of a wartime evacuation population as unique and in need of being processed, and recognizing that the US government doesn't typically take in a massive influx of a population except for extraordinary circumstances. And under those extraordinary circumstances, each time the US government saw fit, Congress saw fit to pass an Adjustment Act. And we have gone and had over 1,000 meetings with legislators to talk about this. And one of the things we always say is every other modern US wartime evacuation population has received an Adjustment Act. The Afghans would be this would be the first Congress not to do so. It would be a unique historical failure of this Congress. It would also be the first time to do so, and ironically, for a population that follows the US's longest military engagement. So we got to the point in August 2022, a year later, where we had 6 co-sponsors in the Senate, even split between Democrats and Republicans. The lead sponsors would be, on the Dem side would be Klobuchar, Coons, and Blumenthal. And on the Republican side would be Senator Graham, Blunt, and Murkowski. We were so excited to have this. You can see here, we not only have veteran service organizations, Afghan evacuees, Afghan women's rights leaders, Afghan female tactical platoon members, we have SIV recipients. There was really this kind of wonderful coalition of folks who have been so passionately involved in this and its introduction. And we haven't seen it move in the Senate side. I think we've had 5 new Republican co-sponsors in the House. We hope to add 2 new Republican senators in the coming days to weeks, to add to the 3 that we have now. If you look at the compilation of this Congress's Senate, we need to get to 60. Well, in every Senate we need to get to 60. We are confident that we'll be able to get the Democrats. We have 3 official original Republican co-sponsors. We hope to see 5 be on there as sponsors in the coming days. And we need to get to 10 Republicans co-sponsors. And we know that this bill has always been nonpartisan, bipartisan. We have Republican legislators and GOP members in this photo. We have people who constantly work across the aisle, who deeply want to see this bill moved, and so we're working towards that. So that gives
and
you.
We did start a little bit late, but yeah, but I think we still have about 5 minutes until 12:42 before we let people ask questions. But yeah, but we want to know more about the bill and what's inside it or what have you.
Yeah. And I'll keep
So.
this one short. I'll just say this is where we are. We've got the bill introduced. The bill includes that what we talk about, that adjustment of status to lawful, the ability to apply for lawful permanent residence. But it also includes things that were really important for those left behind. In order to seek the adjustment for lawful permanent residence, which giving that lasting protection, that pathway to stay in the U.S., folks have to go to an in-person interview. They'll go through an additional round of background checks and vetting. That is really to sort of answer the questions that people have. If you have this quick evacuation, we see everything you say about vetting, but can you give us an additional layer so that we feel, secure? That was what was negotiated, the Republican Democratic negotiated bill text. It also, it prioritizes SIV, P1 or P2, meaning like folks who work for USID, women's rights groups, and SIV applicants, interpreters. And then if you aren't part of those priority categories, you go through sort of an additional round of vetting or interagency database. This is what we had to do to come to accord in the negotiations for Republican and Democrats. There are 3 other pieces that are major. An interagency task force. That means for, one of the things that Congress and advocates found and Afghans found was they would reach out to one government agency and the agency would do this. That different agencies would tell you to do this. And an interagency task force says that ends, there's an interagency group that handles this and can answer those questions that I have. The second is a mandate for congressional inquiry, or to respond to congressional inquiry. So legislators who have been asking about what's going on, they receive it. And then the third, so there's actually 5. The third is the institution, the resurrection of visa services, consular services in the region. There hasn't been since the U.S. government pulled out, there hasn't been any consular services in order to process visas, family visas, etc. And Congress wants to see the reconstitution of those. And then there's an expansion. The fourth is there's an expansion of more people to be included in the definition of a SIV, and then a few other about reporting mechanisms. Anyways, it has something for people, not only for Republicans and for Democrats, but it also has for a lot of advocates who see people at risk left behind still and need hope, just like our Afghan families that we serve need hope that they will one day be reunited with their family, that they will one day be reunited with their loved ones. So happy to take questions, and sorry for going over and starting late, but it's great to be here.
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. And before we take questions, do you want to speak to these websites, or do you want to do that after?
Yeah, sure. And I didn't know they weren't both bolded. So I'm with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, LIRS. Both of these links, and the second one is HIAS. These are both, we work on the Afghan Adjustment Act. These are resources where you can find, they'll tell you about how to volunteer with Afghans, evacuees, how to partner with these 2 resettlement agencies. But also in them is a message to congressional office. Both of these websites, I picked one where you could, it's not a scramble of letters, but instead help our Afghan allies or Afghan refugee crisis, how you can help. Both of these will have links in them that say contact your Congress member. That is because this December is going to be a critical moment to see the Afghan Adjustment Act attached to whatever spending vehicle moves in December. There will be a spending vehicle. It will either be a rebridge of our current budget, or it will be what is called the omnibus, the big budget that's passed every year. And we want to see the Afghan Adjustment Act attached to that. And we hope to see it move and pass this year in this lame duck session.
Great, thank you. Let me see. So We will go ahead and start answering your questions now that you've submitted during today's presentation. I see that several folks already have, and we'll take about 10 minutes here until about 12:55. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your control panel. Let's see, and actually you just answered one of the first questions, which was when will Congress likely vote on this? And you said December, correct, Susanna?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Let me see.
Though if you're sending messages to Congress or you're calling Congress, I would call them now because they'll start drafting and deciding what's going to be in that this month.
Okay, great. Let's see, a question. What are some of the reservations Congress members have to supporting the Adjustment Act?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the reservations I mentioned, which is people ask questions about, how can you possibly have a vetting program if you have such a influx and evacuation? And you heard me describe the military lily pad bases abroad to the being brought here by CBP where they get individual evaluation. I left out the part where Afghans were then living on U.S. military bases for months and months. I think the last base closure was in February of this year. So vetting was going on during this entire process. But given this, the tremendous sap on an influx and sap on resources, say for peace of mind, we'll do an additional layer of vetting as part of this process. And this allows the kind of what legislators describe as like the gold standard of vetting. And that's the U.S. Refugee Assistance Program, where you run through everything that the U.S. RAP system usually does. And then for non-priority, those folks that I met, they get an additional layer of vetting. That was one of the reservations we've heard. At this point, it's hard to find it genuine if they continue to have reservations, because the response would be, if you believe in vetting and you want more vetting, then you should want the bill that has more vetting. And then another argument we then hear is, we just don't like the way that the U.S. left and the way the evacuation happened, and we don't want to endorse it. And it sounds a lot to me like punishing Afghans in order to hurt the administration. And just so you know, that doesn't work. It doesn't hurt the administration. It only hurts Afghans. And to be honest, anyone who cares about them, including, for what it's worth, our veterans who have talked extensively about moral injury and the phone calls they still receive to this day.
Let's see, another question. Does the Afghan Adjustment Act include components to get the rest of folks' families out of Afghanistan?
Yeah, so those components where I was like, somewhere items 3 through 5, that are not about the adjustment immigration portion. The interagency task force, coupled with the mandate to respond to congressional inquiry, meaning like if I use my constituent services for my local Congress member, the government is mandated to respond, which they haven't been before. And then finally, and I think this is the one that's the most important, is the mandate to reconstitute consular services in the region. I mean, that's the major problem, that there's nobody to give paperwork to in the region. There's nobody processing active SIV applicants or family reunification visas.
Let's see, another question. How are there ways that you think the Ukrainian war and that refugee effort diverted attention from getting the Afghan Adjustment Act passed?
I guess I don't see it that way. Part of the reason that I don't see it is because the world doesn't stop. Big things happen in our lives. People are lost. Wars start. Wars end, and we can't stop the world from spinning because of this crisis in our life, in our country, and that's kind of the nature of this work. And I think, for what it's worth, we would love to make sure that the extraordinary work that the U.S. government has done to ensure that Ukrainians can come here safely, that they use that example of what they can do to help Afghans, and that's particularly with regard to having a sort of a humanitarian parole program, meaning that Afghans can apply from abroad, and that program functions more than just theoretically. Because the humanitarian parole program for Afghans has moved very few people, while we've moved tons of Ukrainians. But I don't think the war in Ukraine was a distraction from serving Afghans. I think that every day we do hundreds of things all at the same time, and it's just, as I've said, it's just about having the right people to stand sentry over that particular part of your work. As long as you're staffing talented, resourceful people in every post, we can do lots of things, hard things at once.
Yes. Let me see. I have kind of a tough one for you, or like a specific question dealing with a specific family. But I'll go ahead and ask it anyway and see what like advice or thoughts you might want to share, whether to this specific situation or just in general. I think there are a lot of people, right, that are that have welcomed Afghans and have specific questions. This person says that they were sponsors to an SIV family who was separated from their 2 children on August 15th. And the kids are now in Kabul. And they have written to their senators to urge them to lobby the US State Department to evacuate the 2 teenagers, and have been told to wait. Do you know how long the waiting list is, or do you know how the waiting list is decided by state? What else could they as sponsors do to advocate or to help reunite this family? Yeah, that's a very tough question, and I know that you probably can't speak to individual situations.
No.
But yeah, do you have any suggestions for people kind of advocating for specific cases?
And I'll say that this is, it's gut-wrenching, and it doesn't stop being gut-wrenching. It's also a story we know is part of this evacuation. We know how many families were separated and made inconceivable choices. I can't tell you how some of this works. I know that the US government has stated that they are prioritizing SIV cases for relocation flights out of the Kabul airport. Those are currently paused because every evacuation flight stops in Doha, and right now Doha is not willing to take people as they prep for an influx of lots of temporary immigrants and tourists for the World Cup. So we knew that this pause was coming. We hoped that there might be a second lily pad through which continued relocation flights could happen. So if the U.S. government says they're prioritizing SIV and U.S. lawful permanent residence cases in the relocation flights, and there was usually just one a week for a number of months, and each one of those based on a relation to a continued willingness by the Taliban to allow those flights to leave from the Kabul airport. And I believe each week that was a negotiation. Then I would presume that the children, the minors of an SIV applicant would also be on that priority list. But there are tens of thousands of SIV applicants still in Afghanistan, and there's only one flight a week. It's just an unacceptably difficult situation. And for what it's worth, anybody who's worked on the refugee program abroad, anybody who's worked with this type of actively targeted population, it's not unusual to have immediate urgent threats of people in their US RAP system, meaning the US Refugee Assistance Program. That pipeline has hundreds of thousands of people who are urgently in need of protection. And it's one of the reasons we talk about if you're in Afghanistan, if you're leaving Afghanistan, you cannot count on the SIV program or the US RAP program to be a fast moving evacuation plan. It never has been.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, that's why we're here today. Let me see. It sounds like another question. It sounds like speaking to what you were saying about folks being in danger, that the Afghan Adjustment Act may not help families who had indirect connections to the military, but nonetheless felt scared and evacuated. Is that the case with the Afghan Adjustment Act, that it might not help, the folks with indirect connections?
So the Republican Democratic negotiated bill allows protections of women's rights advocates, human rights advocates, who are referred to the P1 and P2 program as part of the evacuation. It also says if you made it through the evacuation, you'll be provided access to the Adjustment Act, to adjustment is what I mean. The P2 program is meant to help. The Priority 2 program is meant to help populations who are not U.S. military affiliated. They might have worked for like a USAID. And the P1 program that's the normal refugee program. So if you have an acute protection need because of your identity, whether your gender, your political position, your ethnicity, etc., you can be P1 referred. So there are those populations who are going to be protected because they're P1, because they have priority protection needs. There's also, if they're a family member, it helps everyone who has an active protection issue if there's counselor services. And also if there's an interagency task force and a Congress member takes up your person's case, right? So there really is, I say that there's like a big gap of people who aren't being well served, who could use greater advocacy. But there is something in this bill that helps every at-risk Afghan, which is there is no means to alert your risk to the US government right now and see it processed if you're in Afghanistan, or even sometimes if you're in the region. This bill would reconstitute counselor services so there is a place to go to alert to your immediate at-risk protection issues. But it doesn't mean that there isn't just a massive gap, as there is along the entire global refugee protection program for people who have protection issues, including women's rights advocates.
So the act doesn't necessarily apply to like everyone who evacuated under humanitarian parole.
It does. It applies to everyone who came through the government-led evacuation. So everyone, and it was very clear. It was something that both Republican legislators and Democratic legislators made it very clear that they wanted that protected. Which is, I think sometimes people try to crystal ball read what they think, opponents will think. That was not it. That was not the problem. So it is inclusive of everyone brought through that evacuation population, as it should be, as it historically has been for other adjustment acts.
Yes. Let's see. And then do you have any, like broad suggestions for anyone that's helping, some humanitarian parolee or what have you? There might not be, but like broad advice, like should everyone reach out to a like legal services provider in their community, or is there kind of like broad advice that we should be giving volunteers or sponsors?
So the one we get the privilege of getting to work with Human Rights First every day. And I'll say, if you Google something called PALA, P-A-L-A, it's Project Afghan Legal Assistance at Human Rights First. They have a really great resource just to stay up to date on, not only do you want to know where the Afghan Adjustment Act is, but they're running active asylum cases or SIV cases. And they are also with us. They're co-chairs of the legislative working group at Evacuate Our Allies. So we're working this together to try to move this bill forward. But that legal assistance program is going to be pivotal for making sure that no one falls through the cracks. And that anybody who wants to know where the state of the Afghan Adjustment Act is, or if not, where the state of the asylum, their asylum applications, that's a tremendous resource. I have no idea if they're at capacity, but I have so valued the work that they have done and continue to do. So I would just check them out.
Yeah, and we can try to send it out as well, but folks are asking, could you repeat the name of that, the website?
Yeah, it's Human Rights First is the organization, and the project Afghan Legal Assistance. And I'll see if I have access. Sorry, I'm somewhat new to this, so
Yeah, no, you're
I will
fine. And like I
send.
said, we'll try to send it out in the post email as well. Let's see. And someone was just asking, and we'll kind of make this our last question, I suppose. But we want folks to, follow those websites that you suggested to reach out to their representatives. And then someone also mentioned, are there other specific representatives that we should reach out to, even if they're not our own?
Well, I often want to tell people to reach out to their representatives, and for what it's worth, like me calling in, I don't call into an office where I don't think that they're gonna hear my message, right? And I always try to think, and Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, we have immigration and refugee in our name. We always talk about how for us, we see the face of God in every person. We want a number of immigration bills to move forward. We're also one of the leaders on this bill. And one of the reasons that we can talk about it is how many Afghans we've served. But I also, I know when I'm not the right communicator, when someone else might be a more powerful communicator. So I don't actually often tell people if someone is not, if a legislator isn't often receptive to whatever argument you're making, I don't see a huge value of calling into them and just doing it for virtue's sake. That's just me. That being said, here are people who need to hear from you, regardless of your political position, regardless of your state. Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer needs to know that he should prioritize this bill in upcoming negotiations around the December spending vehicle. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi. These folks are going to have to make some really hard decisions on what to negotiate and really come down to some pretty difficult discussions around what to include in that December vehicle. And for what it's worth, we think this is the Afghan Adjustment Act's critical juncture to see it passed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susanna. And thank you to everyone who attended today. We would like to hear from folks, so please take a moment and follow that QR code, or Grace will probably also drop a link into the chat to suggest topics of future Lunch and Learns like this one, and to provide any suggestions. Like we said, you'll also receive a follow-up email with some links that you can follow. Let me see, and just thank you so much, Susanna. I appreciate you explaining some kind of complex topics, and we appreciate your dedication and heart in this. And I also want to thank all the folks on the webinar today, because I think there are many out there who, like you said, are trying to keep promises and doing a lot for our Afghan neighbors. But thank you so much. Have a good day, all.
Well.